Hello, this is video number 1 for the digestive system. And in this video, we're going to cover the first part of the outline shown here on this slide. Part 1, which is an overview of the anatomy and the physiology of the digestive system. And so I'll spend a little bit of time doing that. And the first part of part 2, which is if you section through the digestive tract, which is a tube, what are the different layers or tunics of the wall of this tube? So we'll talk about the tissue composition of those and some of the main functions of those. Future videos, we'll talk about other anatomy mentioned on this outline. So let's start with a short video introduction to an overview of the anatomy of the digestive system. Hello, this is video number 1 for the digestive system. And I'm going to go through digestive system similar to how I went through the respiratory system. So I'll start out with some videos talking about anatomy. First one is kind of an overview, and then we'll get into more detail in the other anatomy videos. And then that'll be followed by videos on the physiology. And so it'll probably be similar to the respiratory system, something like 5 or 6 relatively short videos covering the material. Just so you know, I modified a room in my house now to do videos, and I'm hoping to do sort of more lecture style and then mix them in with some PowerPoint voiceover type videos, just to, get a better sense of sort of the classroom feel. So for the first video, let's start with kind of an overview of the anatomy of the digestive tract. And what I've written on the board here is basic structural information about the digestive tract. So your digestive tract is a 30-foot tube that runs through you. Most of it is contained in the abdominal cavity. And this tube has different segments. It doesn't really look so much like a tube in some parts, but in other parts it does. And so material is going to enter, food, drink, and start its passage down this tube. Along the way, a number of things happen, and so there's going to be one of 2 fates for stuff that you ingest. Either that is digestible, meaning it's going to be converted from a large form into a small enough form that you can absorb it across the wall of the tube, and that's going to enter into the body. Or it's not digestible, and for example, there are a lot of plant fibers that we are not equipped to digest, and what happens to those is they make the trip from your mouth all the way through this 30-foot tube, and they exit at the anus. So they're not absorbable. So that's one of the 2 fates. Either it gets absorbed into the body or it passes all the way through. So I like to think of the tube as not really being in the body. Even though it's traveling through your body, it hasn't yet entered into the body until materials cross the wall of the tube. Okay, so as far as the tube itself, there are different names for the digestive system. This 30-foot tube, alimentary canal is one name, and aliment means food. So this is the canal, this is the passageway that food travels when you ingest it. You'll also see this gastrointestinal tract or GI tract. This is a little bit more specific. The term gastro refers to the stomach. Intestinal, that's pretty obvious. So that's mostly what's the part of the tube that's in your abdominal cavity. And also another general term for it is digestive tract. So these are the main segments of the alimentary canal, starting with the oral cavity. So some digestion happens there. When you swallow, it goes into your pharynx and then into the esophagus. The esophagus is the only segment that runs through the thoracic cavity. The esophagus connects to the stomach, that connects to the small intestine, and then to the large intestine, and undigestible stuff is going to exit from the body at the anus. So these are the different segments of the alimentary canal, and these are each specialized to carry out a particular function. And that's going to be one of the main topics we'll talk about, not on this video, but on future videos. All right, in addition to the alimentary canal, there are a number of other accessory organs that are involved. And I just want to point out, for the tube along the length of the alimentary canal, this could be any segment, let's say small intestine. Food is passing through the lumen, and it's going to be bumping up against the inner surface of the wall. And when food gets, or material gets absorbed, it's going to be passing across this wall into the body. And what usually happens is it's going to enter into the bloodstream, and it's going to circulate away. Okay? So that's what happens for stuff that does get digested and gets absorbed into the body. For stuff that is not able to be digested, it's going to be completely passed through the alimentary canal and then eventually be excreted in the feces. All right, in addition to the alimentary canal, there are listed on the side here a number of other digestive system organs that are important for the process of digestion or absorption or passage. And so I've listed them. These three on the left are in the oral cavity or connected to the oral cavity. Teeth and tongue and salivary glands. They're kind of involved in starting the process, right? Taking the food in and mashing it, mixing it with saliva. And that's going to help ease the passage through the rest of the pathway. Other accessory organs, liver, gallbladder, and pancreas, they play a specific function in further digestion and also absorption later on when materials get into the abdominal segments of the digestive tract. So that's a very brief, basic introduction, and we'll continue this with more specific information. Okay, so this slide shows basically what was illustrated in that short video. As far as the anatomical structures involved, the accessory organs, teeth, tongue, and salivary glands associated with the oral cavity, liver, gallbladder, and pancreas associated with mostly the intestines. And on the right side of the slide are listed the main segments that I mentioned before: oral cavity, pharynx, and the head and neck, esophagus, passing through the thorax, stomach, small intestine, and large intestine, which are extremely long segments of the alimentary canal, are located within the abdomen. All right, this slide is having to do with the functions of the digestive tract along the alimentary canal. Before we discuss this slide, let's take a look at a short video describing digestive functions. Okay, a little bit about digestive system functions. Some of them are obvious, digestion. Some of them maybe not so much. So I've listed 6 main functions just to go over the list. And so they're shown here. Obviously, in order to digest stuff, you have to take it in. So ingestion is one function. And then next function is, well, motility. Consider your digestive tract is a 30-foot tube. What's going to move it along that tube? How is it going to get from your mouth to your esophagus, etc.? So motility is constantly happening, pushing material forward through the digestive tract. And I listed 2 of the main things involved in motility. Swallowing, that's going to transition food from your oral cavity into your pharynx and then into your esophagus. Then peristalsis is the main thing moving stuff through most of the tubes. So down your esophagus, in the stomach, and in the intestines as well. Obviously, one of the main functions is digestion. Digestion is simply taking something large, breaking it down into smaller. And this can be at the level of physical structure. A ham sandwich. What happens when you take that in? You chew it up, you take the big whole sandwich, and you break it down into smaller pieces of sandwich, mix it with saliva, and so that's called mechanical digestion. Any kind of physical breakdown is mechanical digestion. That's mostly chewing, but there's a little bit of that happens in the stomach as well. And the other type is chemical digestion, and that involves enzymes, and this is breaking chemical bonds. So taking large molecules, breaking them down to smaller molecules. Why do we do that? Because, well, we want to do absorption. Let me skip ahead. Absorption. We want to be able to absorb the breakdown products, and our digestive tract is only able to absorb them if they're really small chemical breakdown products. We can't absorb macromolecules. They have to be broken down to their building block constituents. Okay? So absorption. And in absorption, what's happening is materials are moving from the lumen of the tube across the wall into the bloodstream or sometimes into lymphatic vessels. That's absorption. If it's not absorbed, then it's going to end up being eliminated in the feces. Okay? So absorption, elimination. We skipped over this one, secretion. Secretion is an important function. There's a ton of secretion going on in your digestive tract. So what's secreted? I listed a few things. There's a lot of mucus, especially in the beginning. Mucus is going to ease the passage of large, you chew stuff up, but it's still pretty large, and that's going to be abrasive. And mixing it with mucus makes it slide through a little bit easier. Obviously, there's going to be enzymes secreted when chemical digestion happens. There's a ton of water gets dumped into your digestive tract. That's also going to help stuff move forward, helps with motility, and then at the end of the digestive tract, this water gets reclaimed. And finally, another example is acid in the stomach. One of the main secretions there is stomach acid, and that helps with digestion. So those are the six main functions, that are happening in the digestive tract. All right, so let's look at this slide a little bit more, and this has the six main functions that were described in the video, but this is more kind of indicating where those functions are occurring. So some functions occur throughout, but some are limited to only certain parts of the digestive tract. So for example, ingestion, intake of food, obviously is happening in the mouth, and elimination through defecation of feces is happening at the anus. Some of the other functions, mechanical digestion, physical breakdown. So I mentioned there's a lot of that going on in the mouth, chewing. Some of that happening in the stomach. There are very powerful contractions of the wall of the stomach. And so that's also considered to be mechanical digestion. And a little bit happening in the small intestine as well. Chemical digestion, the main site for that is in the small intestine. So throughout the small intestine, especially in the beginning, there are a lot of digestive enzymes that are secreted into the lumen to assist with that process. Let's see, as far as other functions, secretion and motility occur pretty much throughout. Secretion starts with saliva in the mouth as well as mucus along the entire pathway. In the stomach, there's acid secreted along with some enzymes as well. In the small intestine, a lot of enzymes secreted there, as well as material to neutralize the stomach acid. And that continues, mucus, especially in water, in the beginning part of the large intestine. But as I mentioned earlier in one of the videos, the water is reclaimed
in the later part of the large intestine. And because of that, the undigestible material that remains gets compacted into a relatively solid form, the feces in the rectum. There's absorption. The main site for absorption is in the small intestine, and there's also water absorption in the large intestine. And those are the main sites for that. So this is a good breakdown in terms of where those different functions are occurring. Another main topic for this video is the tissue composition of the wall of the alimentary canal. Different segments of the alimentary canal are going to differ, and they'll be specialized for different functions. But we can define general structural components that will be present pretty much in all layers. So, in all segments. All segments are going to have 4 basic layers that are defined on this slide with very similar tissue composition. So they are, innermost layer is the mucosal layer or mucosal membrane. That's lining the lumen, and that's in contact with material passing through the alimentary canal. The mucosal layer is supported by a submucosal layer. So that makes sense from the terminology. Submucosa is beneath the mucosa with respect to the perspective of being in the lumen. Wrapped around both of those is a muscularis externa. This is a smooth muscle layer. And then wrapped around all of those is a serous membrane or serosa. And this is true for all organs in the abdominal cavity. For the esophagus and the thorax, the outermost layer is called an adventitia. But in any case, both serosa and adventitia can be thought as sort of outer wrapping, protective wrappings for those segments. Let's take a look at a short video describing those 4 layers.
Okay, so the wall of the alimentary canal is made up of different layers, 4 different layers, and some of those layers have sublayers. So I want to go over that very briefly, and then we'll look at a slide with maybe a slightly better illustration than what I drew. So the layers are represented here. Outermost layer is called the serous or serosa membrane. Going inward from that is a layer of smooth muscle called the muscularis externa. And then further inward is the submucosal layer. And the innermost layer lining the inside of the tube and in contact with the food traveling through the lumen. That's called a mucosal layer. Okay? Mucosal innermost supported by submucosal. That makes sense? Muscularis layer wrapped around those 2, and then the outermost has a serous membrane or serosal layer. Right, on the left side here, I've broken out a little bit in terms of composition, and so starting with the outer, and we're going to the inner here. Mucosal membrane is the inner. What is the serosa membrane? So this is wrapped around the tube, and this is in the abdominal cavity, the serous membrane. It's called the visceral peritoneum. Okay, visceral peritoneum. And this is wrapped around the outside of all the abdominal segments of the alimentary canal. So that includes the stomach, it includes the small intestine, and the large intestine. There are a couple exceptions to that, but we'll leave that for later on. In the thorax, and the only segment of the alimentary canal in the thorax is the esophagus, the name of the wrapping on the outside is called the adventitia. It's slightly different, but it is a connective tissue protection. And both have this kind of wrapping around them. Okay? Going in from the serous membrane now, the muscularis externa, smooth muscle I told you, represented in red on that drawing, the smooth muscle is able to contract, and it's actually present in two layers. There's an inner layer that runs around the tube. Okay, so circular, the fibers are running around. When this layer contracts, it squeezes the tube. All right? And there's an outer layer called the longitudinal layer, and in the longitudinal layer, the fibers are running in this direction. All right, along the length, same direction as the tube. When these fibers contract, they shorten the tube. Right? This becomes important when we talk about motility, especially by peristalsis. Peristalsis is a rhythmic contraction in which these layers alternate. There's a squeezing and there's a shortening, squeezing and shortening, and that's going to help to push stuff along through the tube, or let's say this way, through the intestines. It's going to push contents forward. That's the main thing that the muscularis externa is doing. Submucosal layer is next one in, and this is supporting the mucosal layer. So submucosa in green. Submucosal layer is made up of connective tissues, a loose connective tissue, areolar, and a dense irregular connective tissue surrounding that. And in the submucosal layer, you have lots of other things. For example, you have blood vessels, and you have nerve fibers. And this is kind of the layer that those are traveling in, inside the alimentary canal, the wall of the canal. Innermost layer is the mucosal layer. So I said the mucosal layer is in contact with stuff coming through the lumen. And so that's going to be involved in absorption. There's a lot of secretion from this layer as well. Mucosal layer can be broken down into three sublayers. The epithelium is what's in direct contact with the contents in the lumen. And that is supported by a middle layer called the lamina propria. So the epithelium is number one, lamina propria is number two, and the outermost layer is a really thin, smooth muscle layer called the muscularis. That's number three. Okay, so as far as composition of the layers, those are the four main layers, and the main composition and sublayers you'll find them.
All right, so let's take a look at a slide that has probably a slightly better depiction of what I drew on the board. But this is looks like a segment of the small intestine to me. And in bold here are the four main layers: mucosa innermost, submucosa supporting that, muscularis surrounding those two, and then the outermost, serosa or serous membrane layer, which is the visceral peritoneum. So the mucosal membrane can be further subdivided into an innermost epithelium. So that's called the mucosal epithelium. And that's supported by a lamina propria, which is a loose areolar connective tissue. That's supporting the epithelium. And then below that is a very thin layer of smooth muscle called the muscularis mucosae. Muscularis in the mucosa is the meaning for that. That's to differentiate it from this muscularis down here. Okay? This muscularis layer is not really so important in motility, but it can contract. What does so? That can dislodge anything that's maybe stuck in the folds of the mucosal layer. Submucosal layer is pathway for blood vessels, nerve fibers, and you can see the sort of blue and red dots there representing that. Here are the two layers in the muscularis externa. So there's an inner circular layer, and the fibers are running around the circumference of the tube. They're going to squeeze the tube when they contract. The outer longitudinal layer, the fibers here are running in the direction along the length of the tube. They're going to shorten the tube when they contract. And then here's the serous membrane, and that's the outermost covering of this segment of the alimentary canal. So I'm going to end this video here, and in next video we're going to extend this conversation about the anatomy of the alimentary canal a little bit more. See ya.